Should it be? Oh, yeah. Here we go. Okay, so welcome everybody to this session on real-world attacks. We have 4 talks in the session, and you make my life easy because the announcement of the first 2 is the same group of authors. So we have Intermundium DL, assessing the resilience of current schemes to discrete log computation attacks on public key parameters, by me here, Doreen and Laura is going to give the talk.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. In this talk, I'm going to tell you about something called Intermundium discrete log, or Intermundium DL. And this is joint work with Mihir and Doreen. So Intermundium DL is a world, maybe in the near future, where computing discrete logs is possible, but it's costly in terms of running time, money, and equipment. So a rich adversary could compute a small, non-zero number of discrete logs. How could this happen? One possibility is early quantum computers. These could run Shor's algorithm, but maybe it takes a high cost. And we suggest this is at least one possible reality, maybe not the only one. So suppose you're an adversary who can compute a handful of discrete logs. What would you do with this? And all of you might have a different idea. What we came up with is you would attack schemes with public parameters. In particular, you would look at ones that have a short list of group elements H, and you would spend your resources computing these W discrete logs, hoping to compromise the security of many users. So what happens next? If you look at current schemes, it's actually not obvious. Proofs will typically assume that these H's come from some trusted setup, and in particular, the adversary does not know these discrete logs. Many proofs even exploit this as a hardness assumption. So a natural idea is that you would expect attacks in this setting. But if that was the answer, this wouldn't be an interesting talk. So what we found is actually a surprising variation. Some schemes actually fully retain security in Intermundium DL, others retain partial security, and finally, some do break totally. The trichotomy of these results and these highlighted terms is going to be the topic of the rest of the talk. Okay, so first let me recall the discrete log problem. This is parameterized by a group G of order P with some fixed generator little g. An adversary is given a random group element x, and they win the game if they output x prime, such that g to the x prime equals x. Now, what is this group G? Often it's an elliptic curve group of prime order, where p is about 256 bits. And there are a variety of such standardized groups. Now, how hard is it to win this game? Usually we answer this through cryptanalysis. And the results that I've listed in this box all take exponential or sub-exponential time, maybe with some simplifications in the running time. And there are some differences between elliptic curve and non-elliptic curve groups. But the elephant in the room is that there's a quantum algorithm that takes polynomial time. And a question is, given this elephant, is it an immediate threat to elliptic curve cryptography today? So this leads us to the following many krona question. Will quantum computers be capable of running Shor's algorithm on standardized groups in some year in the near future? So you can pick your favorite krona amount, your target year, and you can join a thread on PKC forum that someone has already started. And evidence for yes answers usually looks at theoretical improvements and the fact that quantum computers do in fact exist. Evidence for no will usually look at engineering bottlenecks or economic risks. And Intermundium is somewhere in the middle. We suppose that there's a little bit of time before this quantum apocalypse, and before that we might have slightly different cryptographic options. So we view these options as 3 worlds. In the optimistic one, discrete log remains hard, and classical crypto is totally safe. In this world, our question isn't interesting, since public parameters are safe as well. In the pessimistic view, discrete log is easy, and quantum computers are right around the corner. In this world, our question is also uninteresting, since we should all stop studying discrete log-based crypto. So as I've said, this talk is about Intermundium DL, which is the world where this question is actually relevant. Okay, so let me start with definitions and explain how you formalize security in this world. Well, we start by saying what the relevant schemes are. We call them group element parameter, or GEP schemes. Such a scheme will have a width W, and it will be defined over a fixed group. There's a yellow parameter generation algorithm, which outputs the public parameters pi, which are this list of W group elements H. These H's are used across all users of the scheme, and they're used as input to each user's key generation, which they run independently. They're also input to other scheme algorithms, which could be something like signing or verification. And you can find many such schemes with this paradigm for different widths. So I've listed a few in this purple box, but there are many more. And remember that our concern is that an adversary will target these H's and try to compute their discrete logs. So we're going to capture what happens with security games. So just to remind everyone, a security game considered for some scheme first chooses public parameters pi in this blue box, sends them to the adversary, has some oracles, and will eventually decide if A won the game. And for GEP schemes, these public parameters are a list of group elements H. We introduce something that we call security games with advice. We have the same scheme as above, but we'll slightly change the security game as follows. Instead of the blue box, we start with this purple box, which computes both the public parameters pi and some advice string, which is the discrete logs beta of the H's. We could implement this in a variety of ways, but the game will then send both pi and the advice to the adversary. The rest of the game is the same as above. And you can do this for a variety of games, and we'll always prefix them with this A, so we can end up with something like AUFCMA, ACPA, and so on. So let me make one quick remark about this, which is that I claim that beyond Intermundium DL, these advice security games also capture some natural backdooring strategies as occurred with dual EC. So here, a powerful adversary selected a beta, set H to be G to this beta, and managed to install H as the public parameters in the dual EC standard. Now, if it held on to this beta, it could compromise the security of all users. So our results can also be seen as answering how resilient GEP schemes are to this particular form of natural backdoor. But moving on, our question is, what happens to GEP schemes when an adversary has this discrete log advice? The first possible question you can ask is, can we build schemes that are A-secure or advice-secure? And it turns out that you can. Trivially, you just design schemes without public parameters. And we think this is not such an interesting question. It also incurs other costs like larger key sizes. And so our second question is, are existing schemes A-secure? And this question will be the motivation of our work. We want to know if legacy systems are going to remain secure in Intermundium DL. Okay, so we're focusing only on existing schemes. And to answer what happens to security, we came up with 3 categories. The first is A insecure, meaning that when you have the advice, the scheme is just broken. The second is asecure, meaning that even when you have the advice, the scheme is completely secure. So in fact, the public parameters didn't need a trusted setup. And the third category is something else, which we'll just call partially asecure. So let's look at known and new results. First, we have Okamoto and Katswang signatures. So in the known results, these are both UFCMA under DL or DDH, and our results are that they're advice UFCMA under discrete log for both of them. And they're green because they totally retain security in Intermundium DL. For encryption, we looked at Kramer-Shoup, which is a scheme with width 1. This is known to be secure under DDH for all the encryption notions. And what we see in the advice game is we get ACPA under DDH and ACCA1 under something called delayed target DDH. And we don't know what happens to ACCA2. And I'll also point out that the DDH result is something that Rosalek had informally pointed out on a Stack Exchange post. So it's not totally new, but we formally prove it, and it actually is a corollary of the ACCA1. So next is KOI, which is a PAKE protocol. It's proven secure under DDH. This one is broken, and this is not the surprising case. So this is what you would expect to happen. and we include it to contrast the next result, which is spake2. This is a PAKE which is proven secure under gap CDH, and we're able to prove that it's advice secure under strong CDH, assuming good passwords. And it's yellow because this assuming good passwords is something that I'll need to explain. So this table is basically all of the theorems that we prove, and next I'll go into detail for each of them. So let's start with signatures, and I'll just remind us all of what the UFCMA game looks like. Hopefully we're all familiar with it. And in this version, I've specifically added the H parameter. So the advice game will be a simple modification. There it is. We've added beta, which is the discrete log of H, and it's returned to the adversary. So let's start with existing results. And I told you before that discrete log implies Okamoto UFCMA. And what this reduction says is given a UFCMA adversary breaking Okamoto, we can build a discrete log adversary which, given H, finds the log of H. And there's a similar result for cat's wing under DDH. So what happens in the advice setting? Well, these reductions won't work for the following reason. Notice that both of these interpret their input DL or DDH instance as the public parameter H, and they're ultimately trying to solve for log of H as their hard problem. So in the advice world, the adversary needs the advice up front, and these reductions won't work. So we need new reductions. And this is what we give. And I've added another known result down in the corner, which is that discrete log implies Schnorr UFCMA. What we prove is that UFCMA of Schnorr implies advice UFCMA of Okamoto and cat's wing. And from there, we can see that discrete log then implies the advice UFCMA. And we actually can prove the converses of these theorems, so these three things are actually all equivalent. So let me give you a quick illustration of what one of these advice reductions looks like. Let's pick Okamoto. So I want to prove a theorem that says given an adversary B against the A UFCMA of Okamoto, I'll construct an adversary A against the usual UFCMA of Schnorr. So here are those two schemes. Okamoto's on the left. You can see that it picks an H, and Schnorr is on the right. And just eyeballing them, you might see that they look somewhat similar. Here's a sketch of the reduction, which you don't need to read. Adversary A is in the Schnorr game, and it runs adversary B as shown. What I want to highlight is the reduction is critically using this beta to turn Schnorr signatures into Okamoto signatures, and vice versa for the forgery at the end. So this is simplified from what we do in the paper, but it shows that all of our proofs are going to use beta in a similar way in the reduction. Okay, so that's all I have for signatures, and I'll move right along to public key encryption. And again, here are the usual security games. You don't need to read this in detail, but let me just remind you of the difference between CPA and CCA, which is in this yellow box. And this just involves whether or when decryption queries are allowed in the game. And we'll have the same modification as before to get the advice game. Here it is. We've added the beta, and it's given to the adversary as input. Okay, for public key encryption, I told you that we looked at Kramer-Shoup. So here are the existing results. It has one public parameter H. And here's what we prove. So first of all, DDH still implies advice CPA, which is great. And then we're able to prove that something called DT DDH implies ACCA1. And we don't know about ACCA2. And probably your question on this slide is, what is this DT thing? So let me tell you what it is. And on the left, I've just put the usual DDH game. So some random exponents are picked, a random bit is picked, and the adversary gets G to the A, G to the B, and either G to the AB or G to the R. So in the delayed target game, we have a similar start. We select the same exponents, we pick a random bit, but only G to the A is returned to the adversary. At this point, it gets access to an oracle. On an input Y, this returns Y to the A. We take away this oracle at some point, and now we introduce a new oracle called request target. When A calls this, it will receive the rest of its DDH tuple. So it receives the G to the B and then either G to the AB or G to the R. And it's trying to guess the bit D. So this game was introduced by Litma for security of El Gamal. There are also CDH versions of it. In 2009, Zhu et al. Wrote about an attack that takes sub-exponential time and is a little faster than the general number field sieve, so it's an interesting attack. But I'll note all these papers call this game something else, so you might find it called something else in another paper. Okay, but let me go back to our results about Kramer-Shoup, and I'll give you a quick sketch of the difference between the proofs on the left and on the right. So here's Kramer-Shoup encryption in this blue box. In the reductions, we're considering an adversary who's given a DT or a normal DDH challenge, which has G to the A, G to the B, and some C. And then usual proofs will embed C as the U2 component in a ciphertext, and you'll answer decryption queries using some subtle analysis. In our proofs, C is instead embedded as this F to the K component, and if you do this, you do crucially need to use the beta. And we answer decrypt queries using the CDH oracle that I just told you about in DTDDH. So we can see that the proofs are different, and for Kramer-Shoup, we might get slightly worse security in the advice world, but it still is better than nothing. So this is why we see this as partially secure, and we colored it yellow in the table in the beginning. Okay, so the last section is about PKCs. First, I'll very quickly say what a PKC is. It's a protocol through which a client and server who share a password agree on a shared session key. It's usually described by a picture that looks something like this. And there's a PKC game-based security notion, which I'm not going to tell you what it is. Just notice that the adversary is given the public parameters. And we make the same chains that we've made in all of the sections. For the advice game, we give the adversary the logarithms of these H's. So I'll start with the KOI protocol, and all I want you to notice is there's 4 public parameters for this scheme that are group generators. And I'll simplify the protocol a little bit, and all I want you to notice is what's in this red box, which says to break PKC security, it suffices to learn this value G to the password. So this is exactly what I claim you can do in the advice game. Essentially, if you're given as input beta, which is the log of this second parameter H, you can compute G to the password, and to do this, you need to use beta. So we conclude that KOI is A in secure and intermundium DL. So this doesn't contradict anything. It's not contradicting the original KOI paper because it is secure, assuming beta is secret. But when beta is known, it's not secure. Okay, so the next scheme is SPAKE2. Again, it has these 2 public parameters, and it actually looks a lot simpler. So SPAKE2 was first described by Abdallah and Poincheval in 2005. It has a 2023 RFC, which is mainly because of existing usage in variants of Kerberos, and the most recent proofs are from Abdallah and Barbosa under GAP CDH. So in the result I just mentioned, which is the blue part, SPAKE2 is proved secure under GAP CDH, assuming medium quality passwords. So I'll have to tell you what that means. But our result is basically that SPAKE2 achieves advice PKC security under strong CDH, assuming high quality passwords. So we're making a stronger password assumption. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, I'm just calling low passwords something that are attackable with online queries. I'm calling medium passwords things that are prohibitive to attack online, but you could attack them with offline hash queries. And then high passwords are prohibitive both offline and online. So let's look at what security you get. So in the usual security, you can only break low passwords, but medium and high passwords are fine. And in the advice game, medium ones are broken and high passwords are fine. So what this means in proofs is we give an offline dictionary attack against SPAKE2 when you have the advice, so medium ones are broken, but we can prove a theorem that says this is actually the best attack. So if you have a very high quality password, you're fine. And many people do use high quality passwords if they're using something like a password manager, so these people would retain security in intermundium DL. And so we see this as sort of a partial positive result, or at least hedging, that you retain some security in intermundium DL. Okay. So I'll just conclude with some questions. Some immediate ones are just, are there other positive results? This middle one, this middle one, if you find yourself designing a new GEP scheme with some trusted setup, maybe check if it's necessary. I'll say that it usually is, but it's quite possible that you could do a different proof and you would get something like intermundium DL security for free. And finally, you might have questions about our model. It's very pragmatic, so it's very simple, but it's strong, and we're able to prove a variety of things. But it's not capturing everything you could do with an expensive discrete log solver. So I invite you to see if there are other ways to model this. And with that, thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions.
Questions? There's one question. Should I go? No, it's your choice.
Thank you. Since there was a question mark for CCA2 security, I assume you found neither a reduction nor an attack.
Right.
So can you give some intuition about what was the hard part in this?
So to prove it, you would need to figure out how to answer decryption queries. And we got away with it in CCA1 because we had this delayed target game, which had this oracle where we kind of just could answer decryption queries. And it wasn't clear how you would do this in CCA2. For the attack, we just didn't find one. There wasn't like a particular challenge, but it was decryption queries for the proof.
All right, thanks.
More questions?
When you say high quality password, do you mean some random strings or yeah, with high entropy, something like that?
Yeah, basically it just needs to be something where you couldn't do an offline dictionary attack.
So it's just strong like a symmetric key or?
Yeah, it should be something high entropy. I don't know exactly how many bits of entropy you would want, but yeah, something that is too high to run a bunch of hash queries on and figure out what the password is.
Okay, thanks.
You said on the previous slide that some attacks might be missing from your model, but if I remember correctly, the attacker just gets all D-logs in the model, so what kind of attacks could be missing?
That's a good question. So the setting is basically, you say you have like 100 users and they're all using like one public parameter. Maybe there's a smarter discrete log you could solve for than the public parameter h. There are also lots of algorithms for discrete log that have like some pre-computation that will like build some advice that's like something about like the structure of the group, and so that's not captured either. But yeah, thank you.
All right. Does the world intermundium factoring exist, or shall we invent it? Or maybe it's not that interesting. No?
That's a good question. So with RSA type assumptions, there's not really a public parameter used across all users.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think it might be kind of secure in intermundium by default because there are no public parameters for RSA.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe a good next paper, follow up. Okay, good. Let's see. That's it, right? Yes. Okay, as I already told you, we have the same group of authors here, and Laura is also giving the talk here for public algorithm substitution attacks, subverting hashing, and verification.
Yes, so hello again. This talk is about another paper that is joint work with Mahir and Doreen. If you're sort of wondering, like me, how the talks ended up next to each other, these two papers were basically came out of, we looked at different kinds of subversion. So this talk will be about one called algorithm substitution attacks in some new settings. So let's start with a textbook view of cryptography. Here, Alice has a correct and honest implementation of encryption. She can input a message M to be encrypted and sent as a ciphertext to Bob. Security definitions, such as the ones that I've listed, they do aim to capture increasingly powerful adversaries, but they're all continuing to assume this correct and honest implementation. However, one can go further and consider that the encryption algorithm could be subverted. So what does this mean? It means that Alice's encryption algorithm has replaced by some enc tilde whose code is adversarially designed. So this enc tilde still has access to and uses the honest key K. You can think of the adversary's goal as wanting to learn the key K based on the ciphertext created by the subverted algorithm. Moreover, it wants to do this without arousing too much suspicion. And for this purpose, there might be some subversion key that's embedded in both the subverted algorithm and kept by the adversary. The idea of such an attack was first envisioned as kleptography in this work and others by Young and Young. In 2013, the Snowden revelations crystallized concerns about mass surveillance, at least in the United States, and this led to a series of papers that were looking at different kinds of subversion. One outcome was a formalism of something called an algorithm substitution attack, or ASA. This started with Bellare, Patterson, and Rogaway, and it's a line of work to define and understand this category of subversion. Some papers give attacks, some papers give defenses. This talk today is about attacks and some new definitions that they suggest. So BPR gave two critical properties of an ASA. Basically, the exfiltration should work, and the subversion should be undetectable. So I've just shown you symmetric encryption, where enc is replaced by some enc tilde. Follow-up works have looked at things like signing, so now sign is replaced by some sign tilde, and the goal is to exfiltrate the signing key. You could also look at symmetric or asymmetric decryption, where now the goal is to exfiltrate the decryption key. And people have even looked at protocols where you have a session key that might be exfiltrated. So notice that in all of these we have the same basic picture. Alice's honest, secret keyed algorithm is subverted and replaced by this orange subverted algorithm. And the adversary's goal is always to learn the secret K. For this reason, we call this kind of attack a secret ASA. But the title of this talk said public ASAs, not secret ones, so that will be the topic of this talk. In brief, our contributions are first a definition and a construction, both of which are very general. They apply to any public algorithm. And then we look at different settings to see if the general framework, in fact, makes sense when you start looking at specific settings. So I haven't even said yet what a public algorithm substitution attack is, so let's start with that. Put simply, it's an ASA on a public algorithm rather than a secret one. So our attacker is going to subvert this blue implementation of alg, which has no secret material. There are two parts of the attack. The first is this orange alg tilde, which is the malicious implementation of alg. As before, somehow this is installed as Alice's code. And we're additionally going to let the attacker, as they're programming this alg tilde, retain some kind of exploit algorithm. So a question here is, what exactly is the PASA? I have these three colored boxes, but what exactly is this? And the way that we define it is as follows. A PASA is essentially a subversion generator. This is an algorithm which takes as input the target algorithm, and it outputs these two attack components. So you can imagine something which takes a piece of code and outputs some new code. The next question is, how would you define an effective PASA? What properties would you want? First, the attack needs some kind of utility. there needs to be some motivation for the attacker to undertake the subversion in the first place. The requirement that we pick is that the exploit allows the attacker to find structured preimages under alg tilde. Now this might seem a little bit arbitrary or maybe too specific, but we'll see that this actually captures all the applications we looked at. So second, all ASA papers discuss undetectability, which says it's hard to black box distinguish the two algorithms. So we'll ask for this as well. But we'll give another new notion that we call exclusivity, and all you need to know at this point is this says that utility is exclusive to the holder of the exploit. So for whatever utility is, nobody else should be able to achieve it. And this turns out to be quite strong, and it seems to be a useful definition for this kind of setting. Okay, so I've given this definition of what an effective PASA is. The immediate question is, can we do it? And we show yes. We give a construction using signatures and something called an embedding function. And our construction is basically a generalization of this work by Goldwasser et al. That was in the context of machine learning backdoors. And then we look in a little more detail at important applications. So let's see what happens when we apply the first 2 points to these different targets. And what we end up with is basically we get some really natural attacks. So for hash functions, as I said, you're finding structured preimages. You can do things like certificate forgery. For verification functions, note that these are another kind of public algorithm. They have no secret material. And basically, our attack will allow things like forgery of false statements or forgery of signatures for proof systems or signature schemes. And these aren't different attacks, they're all just specific cases of our general construction. So we think that the framework makes sense. Okay, so far this has been very general. For the big middle chunk of the talk, I'm just going to talk about hash functions because they're the nice illustration of the ideas. So let's start with the honest picture. We have a hash function h. It's selected honestly by some generator, which might put a hard-coded key in h, but the key is public. The desired security property is collision resistance, which we all know. Now some subversion will take place. So remember what happens is we have a subversion generator, which will take the honest h and output some h tilde and an exploit. And these are both pieces of code, and they might include hard-coded keys. And here's the picture again of Bob with the h tilde and the attacker holding on to the exploit. So going through the definition, I already told you about utility, but remember this says that the exploit should let you find structured preimages under h tilde. So the attacker is able to violate Bob's collision resistance in a very strong way. And you can imagine the API of the exploit as something like you input a desired structure and a desired target, and it outputs a preimage. And for this to even be possible, you have to make some constraints on the structure. You couldn't do this for every possible structure. And I'm really going to sweep this under the rug for this presentation and only refer you to the paper. But it turns out it's possible for most kinds of structure that you would look at, such as requiring a prefix or suffix, requiring that something embeds certain data in something, or whatever other structure you want. So I'm going to breeze through undetectability, but just remember that it is a requirement, and it says it's hard to distinguish h and h tilde. Now let's talk about exclusivity, and this is concerning parties who don't have this exploit algorithm. And exclusivity says that it should be hard to find any input x where h of x differs from h tilde of x. In other words, any difference between the two functions is hard to find by anyone else. And we also give some oracle access to make this stronger, and we'll need to do something to rule out trivial wins. And this implies undetectability, which is the main reason we mostly ignore undetectability. But I told you this was going to be specific to hash functions, and that was kind of too general of a definition. So let's make this a little bit more specific to hash functions. So if h tilde is a hash function, what the attacker really wants is they want it to be collision resistant to everyone else. And we can modify the output of this game to look more like a collision resistance game. And we can call this something like CR exclusivity instead. And this is basically asking that H tilde is still collision resistance, even when you have this extra power, and even when you're in this subverted setting. And it turns out that we can ask for this as well without really any extra work. It actually follows from the exclusivity I just showed you, and it also requires something about the original H. But the definition on this slide is a little bit similar to some other papers about subverted hash functions, and this one is stronger than those mainly because of the oracle and also because you get as input descriptions of things, so it's no longer black box. Okay. So that's all I'll say about definitions, and hopefully the last few sections will be a little bit more concrete. So let's start with one construction idea. This is adapted from a paper by Fischlin et al., and it's moved into our syntax. So remember that we're given some target H, and we're going to be programming H tilde and some exploit algorithm. And what they do, they use a one-way function. They hardcode an input S in the exploit, and they hardcode its output T in H tilde. And H tilde operates on an input X as follows. It parses Y and S prime from X. It checks if S prime maps to T under the one-way function. If it does, it returns Y. Otherwise, it behaves normally. So the exploit does the natural thing you would expect. When you have a target output Y, you just return Y concatenated with S. So this is very simple. It satisfies our syntax, but is it effective? So first notice it doesn't have a lot of utility. You can find preimages, but they have to be structured as this two-part string. So you can't really embed structure. It is black box undetectable, assuming this thing I've called a one-way function is in fact a one-way function. But it's not exclusive, so notice if you see one exploit produce output, you get to see S, which allows you to find preimages yourself. So just seeing one output is enough to violate this exclusivity. Okay, so next I'll go through a simplification of our construction. Instead of a one-way function, we'll use signatures, and we'll use some kind of embedding function. And I want you to imagine that the embedding is just concatenating things for now, and that will make sense in a second. So we're going to hardcode a signing key in the exploit algorithm and a verification key in H tilde, which we program H tilde as follows. On input X, it extracts these three components, the first of which is an output Y, and the last of which is a signature. If the signature is in fact a signature on a message including Y, H tilde returns Y, otherwise it behaves normally. And so the exploit will do the natural thing to make this work. Given a desired output Y, it will sign it, and it will return an X that somehow embeds Y and the signature. You can think of the exploit as signing an instruction, which is basically saying return this Y, and H tilde is operating that instruction if the signature verifies. Okay, so does this achieve what we wanted? So certainly for utility, the signature operations mean that you can cause H tilde to output some desired Y, but we were pretty clear that we wanted a structured preimage, and it's not clear what exactly this embedding is doing. So what I'll say is that I've totally ignored the structure part of what's in the code, and also the embedding and the inverse embedding, but basically those are there for a reason, and how they work, I'll just refer you to the paper. Okay. We get undetectability because of UFCMA of the signature scheme. Essentially, any pathological behavior in H tilde will only be revealed if you give it a valid signature. And we get exclusivity for basically the same reason, and also because we're using signatures instead of a one-way function, we get something different than the warm-up scheme where we didn't get exclusivity. Okay, and we get this CR version just assuming something about H. Okay, so next I'll go through one application in detail, and the goal is to kind of justify that the definition makes sense. So the application is password-based authentication. So here a client will register with a server so that the server ends up with some salt, and a hash of the password together with the salt, and I'll call that value y. To log in, a client sends some password prime, and the server performs the check that I've shown. It hashes the password prime with the salt and checks if it equals this y. Okay, so what would subversion look like if you're trying to subvert this kind of system? So first assume that you know the salt and y, so this is what you would commonly assume. Now you run the PASA to generate some h tilde and some exploit. And remember that if you do this using our construction, you need to give a signature scheme, and you need to give this embedding function. And the desired structure here is basically any input to the hash function will have to have a specific salt as the suffix. So that's the structure here. Now, through some means, h tilde is installed as the server's hash function. And this is another thing that's sweeping things under the rug, but you can imagine that the attacker pushes some malicious code change to some repository with a hash function implementation. Okay, so now the attacker has the exploit. It will try to find a preimage of this y such that the suffix is this salt. And this is exactly what utility says. So the exploit allows us to find something which has the particular salt, and it will be a preimage of the y. So it sends the password, it parses the password star from x, sends it over TLS, and these checks are exactly the same, so it should be allowed in. Okay, so from this example, I just want to highlight that structure is useful. So other definitions of things like this usually don't look at structure. So here it's useful because we're handling the salt. Our second example that I'm not going to talk about in the presentation was forging certificates. And there it's pretty easy to imagine that you want a particular structure. And I'll also point out that in this example, what the exploit gave you, is this password star, which might not be public. It's sent over TLS. It might never be revealed. But in the certificate setting, if you're actively forging certificates, those could become public, and that's where it makes sense to have this exploit oracle, where other people might see things produced by the exploit. Okay, so I'll make a few concluding remarks. So remember, our setting was any public algorithm, and I've only been talking about hash functions for the past few minutes. So one other example is signature subversion, and there's a lot of work on secret ASAs for signature subversion that target the secret algorithm, and we sort of get around their work by targeting the public algorithm instead. So here's the public algorithm. It's a verification. It takes as input a tuple and output 0 or 1. Notice that if you're trying to break signatures, you can simply say something like, our target output is 1, and the preimage structure that we want is the preimage contains some desired verification key and some desired message. And now the job of the exploit algorithm will be filling in the rest of the preimage, which is finding the signature. So something works for verification in other settings, and another setting that we looked at was non-interactive arguments, or NISICs. And here you can imagine that a soundness attacker is really just looking for preimages of 1 that satisfy some structure. And the structure is that there's a desired statement in the preimage of 1. And it applies to any other public algorithm that has this basic setting, where you can phrase the attack as finding structured preimages of something. And so the example I cited before was machine learning classifiers, and the structure might be something like your preimage is close to some desired other preimage. Okay, so that's the end, and I'll take any questions.
Questions? So what you presented is pretty scary. It kind of rules out that you can get security against backdoors, right? Or is it too hopeless view? Because you cannot detect them, right? That's what you prove.
I think it's not hopeless. So, I mean, we prove that you can't detect them in a black box way. But for example, if you look at real types of attacks,
at the code, then it's fine, basically.
yes.
Right?
Well, here we allow you to look at the code. but you could still notice something is weird. There was an attack sometime in 2024 that was something like somebody embedded something in a certificate, and it was noticed because somebody's code was running more slowly, like it was twice as slow, and so they noticed something was wrong that way. So I think it's not hopeless, but you would have to look at maybe non-cryptographic avenues for detecting this kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, non-black box is good.
Yeah.
There's one more question.
So to follow up that line of thought, could this be considered an argument against using obfuscation? Since then, if something is black box indistinguishable, then it's also white box indistinguishable.
Maybe it could. Yeah, I haven't thought about it, but I think that's an interesting thought.
More questions? If not, let's think again. And we continue with a third talk. Okay. Mhm. You don't have it. That's fine. Okay. So the third talk in the section is cryptographic attacks against implicit rejection. The authors are Antoine Jou, Julian Loss, and Benedikt Wagner, and we have a proxy speaker, so thank you very much for that. So Janbo is giving the talk.
Thanks for the introduction, and slides are prepared by Benedikt. So let's start from the Fujisaki Okamoto transform. It's a generic transform that turns a CPA-CQ public key encryption scheme into a CCA-CQ key encapsulation mechanism in the random oracle model. It is a classical result, but in recent years it became active again, mainly in analyzing it in the quantum random oracle model. This is useful in practice because it is used in some NIST PQC submissions, including Kyber. So a quick recap about the FO transform, mainly about its decapsulation. So the decapsulation algorithm first do a consistency check on the ciphertext C. If C pass the check, we goes to the success branch where K is output as a decryption function. If C does not pass the check, we go to the failure branch where the algorithm rejects. So there are two styles of rejection. First is the explicit rejection. Here the failure branch output an arrow symbol. The other is the implicit rejection. Here the failure branch outputs some fake key, which is a hash of the ciphertext C and a seed S. Here S is an independent seed included in the secret key, and it's only used here in the implicit rejection. For some reason, mainly because for some reason implicit rejection is preferred, mainly because it has tighter bounds in the quantum random model, at least in earlier work. So it is also used in Kyber. Kyber choose to use implicit rejection. But this work observed that implicit rejection can be less secure. This work studied implicit rejection in a cryptographic setting. And the result says that cryptographic attacker can break it. This work gives 3 attacks. And the first one is really efficient and effective. The second one is not that efficient. And the third one do some preprocessing and then reduce the online time. But you can see at least all of them has a good advantage to break the scheme. So what is the setting of collaptography? Collaptography. So here, the user runs some cryptographic algorithm, and we consider attacker that can subvert the code run by the user. So the collaptographic attacker can subvert the algorithm run by the user here. And the attacker has two goals, success and undetectability. The first goal, success. Here, the user interacts with the subverted algorithm in a black box manner. This is the background and justification is that usually the user does not check the code, and sometimes the code is stored in some secure module, so the user cannot check it actually. Here the algorithm is subverted, and the adversary also interact with the user in some standard security game, for example, the CCA game. The goal is to break the security for the subverted user, and in this world, they consider recover the full secret key. The second goal, undetectability, the user should not be able to detect the subversion when they have black box access to the algorithms. So let me explain the main idea of the attacks. The main idea of the second and the third one, they are the less efficient ones, but the idea is really simple. So recap the two branch of the decapsulation. And the security proof of FO transform essentially says that from the success branch, the attacker can get nothing. So we attack the failure branch. The idea is to make seed S depend on the secret key SK. So the attacker subvert the key generation algorithm to make the seed S become a hash of AK and some bits of SK. AK is an attacker key, which is a backdoor that the attacker embeds. SK is the decryption key. So since AK is random, has enough entropy, then S is also random, so the user cannot detect this change. But the rejection keys now leak bits of SK. So the attacker can just make the caption query and get some information about SK. So you can see the attacker knows the ciphertext C. So when it see the hash of C and S, it gets an information of S. Also, the attacker knows AK. So S also leaks some information about SK. So this is the attack idea. Lastly, some open questions. So first about mitigations. This will discuss some countermeasures against this attack, but it's still open there which is the best. And what's the conclusion for NIST PQC standardization? Should we turn from implicit rejection to explicit rejection? Or are we okay with implicit rejection because this model is too strong, we don't need to care about this? And finally, can we apply the similar technique to attack other primitives like PAKE? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Janbo, for serving as a proxy here. Since you are proxy, I would say we should transfer all questions, or do you want to answer some questions? No, I don't think so, right? So we should transfer. We don't want to stress you with questions. Okay, you don't have that. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Yes, please. All right, Let's come to the last talk of this session. That's PowerPoint, no? Yeah, I have them here. Yeah, good. Now, perfect. Okay, so last talk of this session is deny whatever you want, dual deniable public key encryption, and Sichuan is giving the talk.
Okay, thanks for the introduction from the session chair. And my name is Zhiyuan An, and this is a joint work with Professor Fang Guozhang. Now, let me show more of our works. We begin with some motivations. The basic security notion of public key encryption, IND-CPA, protects data privacy against the passive airdroppers. However, there may be more active adversary, say a cacher, who may approach the sender and force it to open the ciphertext by revealing not only the plaintext M, but also the yield randomness R. For possible countermeasures against such caution attacks, the literature has considered deniable encryption, where the sender can reveal fake but convincing records. That is, there is an additional fake algorithm that inputs the real encryption materials and a fake message M star outputs a fake randomness R star, such that the R star can explain the original ciphertext of M as one of M star. Well, apart from data privacy, user anonymity also takes crucial importance in real-world applications. And in context of PKE, it terms as IKCPA, requiring that one encryption under 1K is always indistinguishable from the encryption of another key for the same message. However, the current deniability cannot protect anonymity against the caution attacks, since the cost sender in this case had to reveal the honest yield public key. So in this work, we are going to consider deniability regarding both data and key privacy. We first defined a one-sided notion called key deniability. The only change is that now the fake algorithm takes a fake public key PK star as input. And now the security is required for the dishonest opening considering the original ciphertext for PK and the honest opening of the encryption exactly for PK star. And by combining the two one-sided notions, message deniability and key deniability, we can now define dual deniability, where the fake algorithm now takes the two fake elements as input. And now the security is considered with respect to the two fake elements. The previous work has shown MD implies IND-CPA. Similarly, we can also show KD also implies IK-CPA. As a simple institution behind this argument, we can say that the caution attacks can be generally taken as an enhancement of the well-known chosen plaintext attacks. This is simply because the cacher can not only see the challenged ciphertext, but also the yield randomness. Now we consider relations of deniability with another security notion called robustness. Robustness is originally defined to prevent ciphertext collisions under different keys, and so helping users in the aforementioned anonymous systems to identify whether a ciphertext is indeed for themselves. Here we consider three different types of robustness. The first, KROB, it requires that the encryption under one key is always different from the encryption under another key, even for the different randomness. And the second, MROB, it disallows the successful decryption of under one key for a ciphertext originally under another key. And the second, FROB, it prevents that two different keys can both successfully decrypt a ciphertext. Then we show KD, and so DD actually contradicts the first two robustness. This is because KD inherently allows the encryption collisions under the original public key PK and the fake one PK star, which breaks KROB. And also, the correctness of PKE further makes sure that such collision can be successfully decrypted on the SK of the corresponding PK. And so it also breaks MROB. Well, luckily, the third one, FROB, is compatible with KD. We show this by observing that the notable IO-based message deniable scheme can be easily made FROB. And we shall later show that this scheme is actually dual deniable. And so the argument follows. Finally, we consider relations within the three deniable notions. Perhaps the most trivial one is that DD is implied by MD and KD. This is because we can achieve DD in a transitive way by first replacing the original message via the function of MD and then the original public key via the function of KD. Besides, we have a more interesting relation for bit encryption. That is, DD is also implied by KD and a robustness FROB. To say this, we can encrypt the message bit into the decryption result. Namely, for bit 1, it's now an encryption of the original public key for a fixed bit, and so is decryptable under SK. Well, for bit 0, it's now an encryption under another different public key, PK prime, for the same message bit, and so is undecryptable under SK. And in this way, since to fake, we do not have to alter the message bit, it's the same one. And so the key faking is enough for dual faking. And for concrete constructions of dual deniability, we shall consider a restricted setting called plan-ahead deniability. Plan-ahead setting requires the sender to determine the two fake elements rightly before the encryption instead of during the encryption. And so, in this sense, the encryption interface takes an additional fake pair as input. And in turn, the fake algorithm also outputs such a fake pair. We shall build plan-ahead DDPKE from another specified PKE with ciphertext simulatability, or CSE for short. Such PKE first admits a specified sampling algorithm that outputs uniform elements from the ciphertext. And it also allows the corresponding inverting sampling, which can explain a normal encryption as a obliviously sampled one. We note that CS also implies CPA security, and it's actually not an expensive property, as most of known PKE schemes actually deliver this property. For our design, the overall ciphertext will contain n sub-elements. The real encryption of M under PK locates at a random index T. At the very next sub-element CT star is the fake encryption of M star under PK star. And all the subsequent encryptions are the masking ones of a random message under a random key. Finally, or the front packages are just oblivious encryptions. And with this suit, the cost sender can just explain the real encryption as an oblivious sampled one by use of the aforementioned invert sampling. And so it can finally open the original ciphertext as the one of M star on the PK star. The decryption is done via a serial decryption of each sub-elements. And to do this, we have to make sure that all these oblivious elements can be identified invalid under the SK. And for this goal, we shall use a one-way function-based check. And namely, we shall encrypt all the normal CI, the CT to CN, and additional nonce U, and also attach the one-way function evaluation sigma of U to the overall ciphertext. And in this way, since all these oblivious elements are independent of sigma, and so U, and then we can easily reduce the inconsistency of the CI and sigma to the one-wayness of the used one-way function. The CPA security of our scheme usually comes from that of the used CSE. This is because we can fabricate all the other CI and sigma after seeing a challenged ciphertext CT from the CSE challenger. However, we cannot further expect the inherited CCA security from the CSE. This is because now the overall ciphertext is clearly malleable. Well, for dual deniability, we can unfortunately obtain a security of an inverse polynomial parametered by n. This is mainly because that the opening difference of honesty and dishonesty is dependent on the distribution of the index t and t star, whose distance is unlikely scaled by the parameter n. So to further obtain negligible detection probability, we consider a weak model, where the sender can first run an alternative encryption called DENC, and later claim that she has run the normal one, ENC. And so the security is only required with respect to the dishonest opening concerning DENC and the honest opening of ENC. We still consider plan ahead setting of this weak model. Here, the minor change is that only the alternative encryption DENC takes an additional fake pair, and the ENC algorithm keeps the standard interface. Thanks to the two-shift encryption style, now we can simplify the overall ciphertext to contain only two elements. To say this, the DENC algorithm just generates a real encryption and a fake encryption. And the ENC algorithm just samples an oblivious element and generates the same real encryption. And in this way, to fake from DENC into ENC, one just have to explain the real encryption as an oblivious element by use of the inverting sampling. And further, now the detection probability only depends on the used ciphertext simulatability, and which is then a negligible function. And we finally reached the aforementioned IO-based scheme, showing that it also dual deniable. Roughly, we do this by showing that DD can be derived from another specified property of the IO-based scheme called public explainability. And for such property, anyone can honestly open a ciphertext by using of a new algorithm explain, which does not need the original randomness as input. and the security is only considered with respect to an honest opening and another honest explanation. We shall show that such notion plus CPU security is magically implying the DD. To say this, we can hope from the honest opening case to the dishonest opening case by first replacing the original randomness as a publicly explained one R star by use of public explainability. And then the original ciphertext on the PK star as the one of PK by use of CPA security. By now, we have presented two schemes that are only CPA secure. So we want to know whether the known CCA security transforms can also preserve dual deniability. However, we first show two negative results of the two well-known transforms. The first, Fujisaki-Okamoto conversion, which involves an XOR evaluation of the plaintext and a random oracle tag. And the second, non-Yang methodology, which utilized a zero-knowledge proof of the plaintext. However, both RO and ZK function are not deniable. This is because they only support an honest opening. Luckily, the Boni-Katz transform is available. This is because they only apply an identity-based encryption. And so we can instead start from a dual deniable IBE. And we note here that the DD for IBE should consider the master public key, not the identity. This is because the BK transform originally takes MPK of IBE as the public key of the resulted PKE. The improved BK transform keeps the original encryption and decryption procedure. And to fake, it just outputs a faked randomness with respect to the fake message amp star and the fake MPK star. And we remark that the BK transform is only proved to have IND-CCA. As a simple extension, we show it also IK-CCA. And as for the final part, we mention some interesting future works. We can consider more definitions and relations of dual deniability. And we can also find more practical constructions of DD, even for the aforementioned weak model, or just for the one-sided new notion K deniability. And that's all for my report. Thanks for your attention.
Questions to the speaker? So, as I understood correctly, you apply a transform on any scheme, and then if the scheme satisfies some property, then your transform adds DD. Is that what I
Yeah,
got?
we actually use a specified PKE called ciphertext simulatable PKE.
Yeah. Can you say something about the efficiency of the transform? There was a series of ciphertexts, right? So
yeah.
how does it relate then to the security parameter? Or?
Actually, for the scheme in the standard model, not the weak model,
Yeah.
this scheme, its security is only obtained with an inverse polynomial, which is the normal method in the deniable encryption. And so we have to consider a weak model. And in this weak model, the elements increased to be 2, and so the security will be a negligible function.
I see. Okay. Good. More questions? If this is not the case, then let's thank all the speakers of the session again. And we have a break now, and we meet together again at 4:40.